In June of 1832, a young Frenchman called Victor Hugo was writing in the Tuileries garden when he heard the sound of gunfire coming from around. Instead of hurrying home like he should have, he followed the sounds and discovered the streets of Paris completely empty. He didn't know then, but Paris had already fallen to the revolutionaries. All he could see was barricades as far as he looked. Halfway on his way back home, he happened upon an area where heavy gunfire was underway. He was surrounded by barricades and took shelter behind them. For more than half an hour, bullets flew in both directions. 30 years later, in 1962, he published his novel Les Miserables. In this novel, he depicted the period that led up to the rebellion that he had witnessed and followed the lives and interactions of several characters over a 20-year period. The novel begins in 1815, the year of Napoleon's final defeat, and climaxes with the Battle of the 1832 June Rebellion. It is considered as one of the greatest novels of the 19th century. Examining the nature of law, grace, the novel elaborates upon the history of France, the architectural and urban design of Paris, politics, moral philosophy, anti-monarchism, justice, religion, and the types and nature of romantic and familial love. The book is divided into 5 volumes, which revolve around the lead characters Jean Valjean, Fantine, Cosette, Marius, and the party fighting at the barricades. It is the third volume that catches up to the time of the June Rebellion. But to fully understand the June Rebellion, it is important to understand what all happened that led up to it. In the 18th and the 19th century, France was constantly facing wars and death. This tore the nation apart. They found themselves in numerous wars, 3 of them within half a century of each other, them being the French Revolution, which lasted from 1789 to 1799, the July Revolution in 1830, and then the June Rebellion in 1832. 1782 to 1832, the years leading up to the many uprisings, were characterized by harvest failures, food shortages, and increases in the cost of living. This created discontent throughout the classes. There was also a cholera outbreak, and people were dying left and right after only 2 or 3 days of starting to show the symptoms. And where there is sickness, there is anger. The reason for all these drastically poor living conditions, for one, had been the fact that France's leadership had been inconsistent since 1789. In 1830, France had a king named Charles X, who was a believer in the divine right to rule. The liberals were angry at him because even after they had won the elections for the Chamber of Deputies, Charles just kicked them out and took away their rights with 4 ordinances. These 4 ordinances had huge political impacts in that it dissolved the recently elected Chamber of Deputies and called for entirely new elections. However, it also immensely affected the social and economic conditions at the time by actively limiting the franchise to the wealthiest people in the country and restricting the freedom of the press. The enraged public reacted by calling the nation to reject the monarchy, while the workers at Paris built barricades in the streets. Although more than 1800 people were killed by the army, they were not able to take control of Paris, and Charles X was abdicated. This event was the July Revolution of 1830. After this, Louis Philippe, who was the Duke of Orleans, was proclaimed as the new leader. Many things changed in France during his reign. The new constitution was regarded as the right of the people rather than the concession of the monarch. The king had to cooperate with the Chamber of Deputies, so he could no longer make laws on his own authority. The new government was anti-clerical and censorship was abolished. Although all these changes were put into place for the good of the people of the France, the government had very little sympathy for the law and the working classes. During the July Revolution, the workers had called for the protection of jobs and better wages. However, none of the demands were met, and the conditions that the workers lived in were extremely poor. Here came in General Lamarck, who was a genuine war hero, loved by the people. He was a leading critic of the constitutional monarchy of Louis Philippe and was a supporter of the liberal causes, which was why all the people loved him. At that time, he was the only man who was speaking out for the working class people. Unfortunately, he died of cholera, and that left the people distraught. His death sparked the June Revolution. The goal was to reverse the establishment of the 1830 July monarchy. His funeral procession became the starting point. A group of angry men used this procession as a demonstration, which very soon turned into clashes between the law enforcement and the student protesters who were leading this event. Within a matter of 2 hours, barricades were formed from wherever and whatever could be thrown into the street. Some eyewitnesses state that the barricades were completed within 12 minutes for some of them. While some of the protesters came prepared with ammunition and guns, most did not, and those unarmed protesters were hesitant to join in the fight. This left a very small amount of people who were armed and ready to give up their lives for France, and they did, almost all of them. The battle lasted for only 24 hours and left up to 800 dead or injured. The king ended up reigning for 16 more years, and all of these young students who had started the rebellion were massacred. It was that Hugo covered in his book, where many of the leads of the story is also the leader of the rebellion. And we closely follow through his eyes the carnage and the extreme loss that was suffered in this rebellion. The rebellion failed to do what they had sought out to achieve. Many historians believe that without Les Miserables, the June Rebellion would have been a hugely forgotten event in France's history. The book has kept that memory awake through its various adaptations, the most notable being the Broadway musical, the live-action movie, and the BBC drama series. It continues to live on, and I am sure would continue to live on a lot in the future. This was my presentation on Les Miserables and its connection to the June Rebellion. Merci beaucoup.